The first story we'll explore is one of the most well-known in the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve. It's a tale that has shaped the way many people understand the beginnings of humanity, and it's packed with symbolism, drama, and deep questions about life, knowledge, and what it means to be human. So, let's go back to the very beginning, to a time when the world was freshly created, pristine and untouched. The Bible tells us that God created the heavens and the earth, and everything in it, in 6 days. But it's on the 6th day that things get particularly interesting, because that's when God creates human beings. First, there's Adam, the first man. He's formed from the dust of the ground, and God breathes life into him, making him a living being. Just think about that for a moment, life itself, the very breath of God, entering into this creature made from the earth. It's a powerful image, one that speaks to the deep connection between humans and the earth, between body and spirit. Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden, a paradise filled with all kinds of trees and plants, rivers and animals. The garden is a place of beauty and abundance, where everything Adam needs is provided for him. There's no need to toil or worry. It's a perfect existence. But there's one condition. In the middle of the garden, there's a tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God tells Adam that he can eat from any tree in the garden, but not this one. If he does, he will surely die. Now, at this point, Adam is alone in the garden. Sure, there are animals, and he even gets to name them all, but there's no one like him. So God decides it's not good for Adam to be alone and creates a companion for him. But instead of creating Eve directly from the ground like Adam, God puts Adam into a deep sleep, takes one of his ribs, and forms Eve, the first woman. When Adam wakes up and sees Eve, he's overjoyed. She's someone who is like him, made of the same stuff, flesh of his flesh, bone of his bones. The two of them are now the caretakers of Eden, living in harmony with each other and with all of creation. For a time, everything is perfect. Adam and Eve live in the garden, enjoying its bounty, walking with God in the cool of the day. They are innocent, unashamed, naked but without any sense of vulnerability or guilt. It's a picture of pure harmony between humans, between humanity and nature, and between humanity and God. But then comes the turning point in the story, and it all starts with a serpent. This serpent is described as being more cunning than any of the other creatures. It approaches Eve and starts to question her about the command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent is sly, insinuating doubt with its questions. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? It asks. Eve responds that they can eat from any tree except the one in the middle of the garden, and that if they eat from it or even touch it, they will die. But the serpent challenges this. You will not surely die, it says, for God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This is a crucial moment. The serpent suggests that God is holding something back, that there's more to life, more to existence, than what Adam and Eve currently know. It plants the idea that disobedience could lead to enlightenment, to becoming like God. Eve looks at the tree again, but this time with different eyes. The fruit looks good, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. It's not just about the taste. It's about what the fruit represents. Knowledge, power, autonomy. Eve takes the fruit and eats it. Then she gives some to Adam, who is with her, and he eats it too. In that instant, everything changes. Their eyes are opened, just as the serpent said, but instead of becoming like God, they realize they are naked. For the first time, they feel shame and vulnerability. They hastily sew fig leaves together to cover themselves, trying to hide their newfound sense of exposure. It's a powerful image of how innocence is lost and how self-awareness brings with it a sense of fear and inadequacy. Later, they hear God walking in the garden and, for the first time, they hide from him. God calls out to Adam, "Where are you?" It's not just a question of physical location, but of their spiritual and moral state. Adam admits they were hiding because they were naked and afraid. God then asks, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" What follows is a series of shifting blames. Adam blames Eve, saying, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it." Eve, in turn, blames the serpent. It's a moment that captures so much about human nature, our tendency to deflect responsibility, to point fingers, to avoid owning up to our actions. But there are consequences. God addresses the serpent first, cursing it to crawl on its belly and putting enmity between it and humanity. Then he turns to Eve, telling her that childbirth will now be painful, and that her relationship with Adam will be marked by struggle. She will desire him, but he will rule over her. Finally, God turns to Adam, cursing the ground because of his disobedience. No longer will the earth yield its fruit effortlessly. Adam will have to toil and labor for his food, fighting thorns and thistles. And ultimately, Adam is reminded of his mortality. For dust you are, and to dust you will return. The story ends with Adam and Eve being banished from the Garden of Eden. They are no longer allowed to live in paradise. They must leave and face the harsh realities of the world outside. God places cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life, ensuring that they cannot return and eat from it, which would grant them eternal life. This story, though ancient, is incredibly rich in meaning and has been interpreted in countless ways over the centuries. It's a story about the loss of innocence, the consequences of disobedience, and the complexities of human freedom and choice. It's also a story that speaks to the human condition, our yearning for knowledge, our struggles with temptation, and the consequences of our actions. The story of Jephthah and his daughter from the Book of Judges. This story is a bit more obscure, but it's a powerful narrative that explores themes of faith, vows, and the tragic consequences of rash decisions. So, let's set the stage. We're in the period of the Judges, a time in Israel's history before they had kings. The Israelites were living in the Promised Land, but they were constantly under threat from surrounding nations. The Book of Judges is full of stories about how the Israelites would fall into sin, be oppressed by their enemies, cry out to God, and then be delivered by a judge, who was more of a military leader than a judge in the modern sense. Enter Jephthah. He's an interesting and complex character, someone who doesn't fit neatly into the hero mold. Jephthah was a Gileadite, and his story begins with his rather difficult upbringing. His father, Gilead, had children with his wife, but Jephthah was the son of a prostitute. Because of his illegitimate birth, Jephthah's half-brothers didn't want him to share in the family inheritance. They drove him away, forcing him to leave his home and live in the land of Tob. Here, Jephthah became something of an outcast, a leader of a band of worthless men, as the Bible puts it, basically a group of renegades or mercenaries. But then trouble comes to Israel. The Ammonites, a neighboring people, are causing problems, and the Israelites are in need of a strong leader to help them fight back. The elders of Gilead, realizing they need someone with military prowess, turn to Jephthah, the very man they had once driven away. They ask him to lead them in battle against the Ammonites. Jephthah, who had been rejected and marginalized, now finds himself in a position of power. But he doesn't accept their offer immediately. He's a shrewd negotiator and knows he holds the upper hand. He agrees to lead them on the condition that, if he is successful, they will make him their leader. With this agreement in place, Jephthah prepares to go into battle. But before he does, he makes a vow to God, a vow that will become central to this tragic story. Jephthah prays to God and says, "If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering." It's an impulsive vow, made in the heat of the moment, perhaps out of desperation or a desire to secure God's favor. But it's also a vow that reflects the serious nature of making promises to God, something that was deeply ingrained in the culture of the time. Jephthah goes into battle, and true to his word, God delivers the Ammonites into his hands. The Israelites achieve a great victory, and Jephthah returns home triumphant. But then, the story takes a heart-wrenching turn. As Jephthah approaches his house, who should come out to greet him but his only daughter? She's dancing, celebrating her father's victory, completely unaware of the terrible vow he has made. Jephthah is devastated. He tears his clothes, a sign of deep grief and despair, and cries out, "Oh no, my daughter! You have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." The horror of the situation becomes clear. Jephthah has promised to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house, and now it is his beloved daughter. The daughter, unnamed in the story, responds with remarkable courage and acceptance. She doesn't argue or plead for her life. Instead, she tells her father to fulfill his vow to God. But she asks for one thing: to be allowed to go into the hills for 2 months to mourn her virginity with her friends. This request highlights the cultural significance of marriage and childbearing in her society. She mourns not just her impending death, but also the life she will never have, the children she will never bear, the family she will never create. Jephthah agrees, and his daughter goes into the hills with her friends. After 2 months, she returns, and Jephthah fulfills his vow. The Bible is somewhat vague about the exact nature of the sacrifice, but the implication is that Jephthah indeed sacrifices his daughter as he had vowed. This act is one of the most tragic and troubling events in the Bible, raising deep questions about the nature of vows, the responsibilities of leadership, and the costs of rash decisions. The story of Jephthah and his daughter is one that has been interpreted and debated for centuries. It's a narrative that doesn't offer easy answers or a comforting resolution. Instead, it forces us to confront the complexities of human actions and the sometimes devastating consequences that can follow. Jephthah's vow, made in a moment of desperation, leads to a tragedy that overshadows his victory. It's a stark reminder of the weight of our words and the importance of thinking carefully before making promises, especially to God. This story also speaks to the theme of sacrifice, a concept that runs throughout the Bible. Sacrifices in the ancient world were often about seeking favor or forgiveness from the divine, but in Jephthah's case, the sacrifice becomes a test of faith and integrity, one that ends in personal tragedy. The willingness of Jephthah's daughter to accept her fate, and her insistence that her father keep his vow, adds another layer of complexity to the story. Her actions suggest a deep sense of duty and faith, even in the face of unimaginable circumstances. Let's dive into another story, one that's intriguing and a bit more unusual, with a focus on the life of Ehud, one of the lesser-known judges of Israel. This story comes from the book of Judges, and it's a tale of cunning, bravery, and an unexpected twist that leaves a lasting impression. It's one of those stories that, once you hear it, you never quite forget. So, let's set the scene. The Israelites, once again, have fallen into sin, turning away from God and adopting the practices of the surrounding nations. As a result, they come under the domination of Eglon, the king of Moab. Eglon isn't just any king. He's portrayed as a particularly oppressive ruler, and he has the Israelites in a tight grip for 18 long years. The Israelites are forced to pay tribute to Eglon, essentially handing over a portion of their goods and wealth as a sign of their subjugation. It's a humiliating situation, and the people cry out to God for deliverance. Enter Ehud, the unlikely hero of our story. Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin, and there's something unique about him. He's left-handed. Now, this detail might seem minor, but it's actually crucial to the story. In the ancient world, being left-handed was often seen as unusual or even sinister. The word sinister itself comes from the Latin word for left. But in this case, it's Ehud's left-handedness that gives him an advantage. The Israelites choose Ehud to deliver the tribute to King Eglon, which is no small task. Eglon is residing in a city called Jericho, also known as the City of Palms, a place that is likely well fortified and heavily guarded. Ehud prepares to make the journey, but he has more in mind than just delivering the tribute. Before he sets out, Ehud secretly makes a double-edged dagger, about 1.5 feet long, and he straps it to his right thigh under his clothing. This placement is key because most people would expect a weapon to be on the left side, where a right-handed person would draw it. By hiding the dagger on his right thigh, Ehud increases the chances that it will go unnoticed. Ehud arrives at Eglon's palace with the tribute, a moment filled with tension. Eglon, we're told, is a very fat man, which is a detail that might seem strange, but it plays into the story's unexpected and somewhat dark humor. After presenting the tribute, Ehud dismisses the people who carried it, signaling that he has something more to say, something private. He tells Eglon that he has a secret message for him, a phrase that piques the king's interest. Eglon, curious and perhaps intrigued by the idea of a secret, orders his attendants to leave the room so that he can hear this message in private. Now it's just Ehud and Eglon, alone in the cool, private chamber where Eglon sits. The tension in the air must have been palpable, with the king likely expecting some sort of revelation or prophecy. Ehud approaches Eglon and says, "I have a message from God for you." As Eglon leans forward to hear, Ehud reaches with his left hand. Again, an unexpected move, draws the dagger from his right thigh and plunges it into Eglon's belly. This is where the story takes a shocking and somewhat grotesque turn. The dagger sinks in so deeply that the hilt goes in after the blade, and Eglon's fat closes over it, effectively sealing the wound. The Bible even adds that Eglon's bowels discharge, a detail that emphasizes the messiness and brutality of the act. Ehud leaves the dagger buried in the king's body, and without missing a beat, he calmly exits the room, locking the doors behind him. Ehud makes his escape while Eglon's servants, unaware of what has happened, wait outside. After a while, the servants begin to wonder why Eglon is taking so long. They assume he's relieving himself in the cool chamber, and they're reluctant to disturb him, out of a mixture of respect and embarrassment. But as time passes, they grow concerned and finally unlock the doors, only to find their king dead on the floor. By this time, Ehud has already made his way back to the Israelites. He rallies the people, telling them that the Lord has given Moab into their hands. The Israelites seize the opportunity, follow Ehud into battle, and defeat the Moabites, securing their freedom from Eglon's oppression. The Bible notes that after this victory, the land had peace for 80 years, a significant period of rest and stability in a time often marked by conflict and turmoil. The story of Ehud and Eglon is a fascinating one, not just because of its unexpected twists and graphic details, but also because of what it says about leadership, cunning, and the ways in which God delivers his people. Ehud isn't the typical hero. He's an outsider in some ways, left-handed in a right-handed world, and he uses this to his advantage. His victory is as much about his cleverness and boldness as it is about brute strength. It's a story that reminds us that sometimes deliverance comes in unexpected forms and that the most unlikely individuals can become instruments of significant change. This story, found in the Book of Numbers, is a blend of the mysterious, the miraculous, and even a touch of the comedic. It involves a prophet who finds himself caught between divine will and human greed, and a talking donkey who turns out to be wiser than his master. It's a story that's as captivating as it is thought-provoking. So, let's set the scene. The Israelites, after their long journey through the wilderness, are approaching the Promised Land. They've camped in the plains of Moab, on the eastern side of the Jordan River, near Jericho. Their presence and the stories of their victories over other nations have caused quite a stir among the local kings, who see them as a significant threat. Enter Balak, the king of Moab. Balak is terrified of the Israelites. He's seen what they've done to the Amorites, and he fears that his own kingdom will be next. So, instead of confronting them with military force, Balak decides to try something a bit more unconventional. He decides to use a curse. Balak believes that if he can get someone powerful to curse the Israelites, it will weaken them and give him the upper hand. And he knows just the man for the job: Balaam, a well-known prophet who lives near the Euphrates River. Balaam is an interesting character. He's not an Israelite, but he's a recognized prophet, someone who has a reputation for having his blessings and curses come true. He's the kind of figure who exists on the fringes, someone who communicates with the divine but is also swayed by the allure of wealth and power. So, Balak sends messengers to Balaam, offering him a hefty reward if he'll come and curse the Israelites. When the messengers arrive, Balaam does what a prophet should. He consults God. And God's response is clear: do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed. God's message leaves no room for doubt. The Israelites are under God's protection, and Balaam is not to curse them. Balaam, to his credit, initially obeys. He tells Balak's messengers that he can't go with them, and they return to Moab with the bad news. But Balak isn't one to take no for an answer. He sends another delegation, this time with even more distinguished officials and a promise of greater riches. Balak is essentially saying, name your price, whatever you want. It's yours, as long as you curse these people. Now, here's where things get complicated. Balaam knows what God has said, but the temptation of wealth and honor starts to weigh on him. He tells the officials, even if Balak gave me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not do anything great or small to go beyond the command of the Lord my God. But then he adds, stay here tonight so that I can find out what else the Lord will tell me. This is where we see Balaam's inner conflict. He's hoping that maybe, just maybe, God will change his mind, or that there's some loophole that will allow him to both obey God and get the rewards. That night, God speaks to Balaam again, but this time he says something different. Since these men have come to summon you, go with them, but do only what I tell you. It's almost as if God is testing Balaam, giving him enough rope to see what he'll do. Balaam is quick to take the opportunity and sets off with the Moabite officials the next morning. But as Balaam is on his way, riding his donkey, something unexpected happens. God sends an angel to oppose him. This angel is armed with a sword and stands in the road, ready to block Balaam's path. Now, here's the twist. Balaam doesn't see the angel, but his donkey does. The donkey, seeing the danger ahead, tries to veer off the road into a field to avoid the angel. Balaam, oblivious to the threat, strikes the donkey to get it back on the road. The angel then moves to a narrower path between two vineyards, where there's a wall on either side. The donkey, still seeing the angel, tries to squeeze past, pressing up against the wall and crushing Balaam's foot in the process. Again, Balaam strikes the donkey, frustrated by what he sees as stubborn behavior. Finally, the angel moves to a spot so narrow that there's no way to get around. The donkey, with nowhere else to go, simply lies down on the road, refusing to move. Balaam, now furious, strikes the donkey a third time. And this is where the story takes its most surprising turn. The donkey speaks. Yes, the donkey opens its mouth and says, "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" Now, Balaam's response is almost as surprising as the talking donkey itself. He doesn't seem shocked or even curious about the fact that his donkey is speaking. Instead, he answers the donkey, saying, "You have made a fool of me. If only I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." It's as if Balaam is so blinded by his anger and frustration that he doesn't even realize how extraordinary this situation is. The donkey then continues, "Am I not your own donkey, which you have always ridden, to this day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" Balaam has to admit that the donkey has never behaved this way before, which finally makes him pause and think. At this moment, God opens Balaam's eyes, and he sees the angel standing in the road with a drawn sword. Balaam bows low and falls face down, realizing the gravity of the situation. The angel confronts Balaam, asking, "Why have you beaten your donkey these 3 times? I have come here to oppose you because your path is a reckless one before me." The angel explains that if the donkey had not turned away, Balaam would have been killed, but the donkey spared his life. This encounter is a turning point for Balaam. He admits his wrongdoing and offers to turn back, but the angel tells him to continue on his journey, with a stern reminder, "Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you." Balaam proceeds to Moab, but he now understands that he is walking a fine line and that he must be faithful to God's word, no matter what rewards are offered. When Balaam finally arrives in Moab, King Balak takes him to a high place where they can see part of the Israelite camp. Balak is eager for Balaam to curse the Israelites, but Balaam warns him that he can only speak the words that God puts in his mouth. 3 times, Balak takes Balaam to different locations, hoping that a change in scenery might change the outcome. But each time, instead of cursing the Israelites, Balaam ends up blessing them. The words that come from Balaam's mouth are not his own but God's, and they affirm God's blessing on Israel. In the end, Balak is furious, and Balaam leaves without receiving the promised riches. The story ends with Balaam's blessings ringing in the air, a powerful reminder that God's will cannot be manipulated or bought. The story of Balaam and his donkey is a rich and multi-layered narrative. On one level, It's a story about the dangers of greed and the importance of obedience to God. Balaam's initial willingness to entertain Balak's offer, despite knowing God's clear command, shows how easily even a prophet can be tempted by wealth and power. Yet, through the miraculous intervention of a talking donkey and a divine messenger, Balaam is reminded of his place and the seriousness of his mission. On another level, the story is about perception and spiritual blindness. Balaam, the prophet, is supposed to have a clear vision of God's will. Yet it's the humble donkey who sees the angel first. This reversal of roles underscores the idea that wisdom and insight are not always found in the expected places. It's a lesson in humility, reminding us that God can use even the most unlikely of creatures to fulfill his purposes. Let's dive into another intriguing and lesser-known Bible story, this time, the tale of Gideon and the fleece from the book of Judges. This story, much like the others, is rich with meaning and speaks to the themes of doubt, faith, and the often unexpected ways that God calls and equips people for his purposes. We find ourselves in a familiar situation for the Israelites during the time of the Judges. Once again, the people have turned away from God, and as a result, they are oppressed by their enemies, in this case, the Midianites. The Midianites were a nomadic people who, along with the Amalekites and other eastern tribes, would invade Israel every year at harvest time. They would swoop in like locusts and destroy the crops, taking whatever they wanted and leaving the Israelites impoverished and desperate. The situation had become so dire that the Israelites were forced to hide in caves and strongholds just to survive. Amidst this oppression, the Israelites cry out to God for help, and God, in his mercy, sends them a deliverer, a judge. But this time, the deliverer God chooses is an unlikely hero named Gideon. When we first meet Gideon, he's not exactly what you'd expect a mighty warrior to be. In fact, he's threshing wheat in a winepress, which is a bit of an odd place to be doing that job. Normally, wheat is threshed in an open, elevated area where the wind can carry away the chaff. But Gideon is threshing in a winepress, a sunken place, because he's hiding from the Midianites. This tells us a lot about the situation. Gideon is scared, and he's doing whatever he can to protect what little food they have left. Then something extraordinary happens. An angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." It's a surprising greeting, given Gideon's current situation, and it's clear that Gideon himself doesn't feel very mighty. In fact, he questions the angel, saying, "If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about?" Gideon is essentially asking, if God is really on our side, then why are we suffering like this? The angel responds not by answering Gideon's questions directly, but by commissioning him, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon's reaction is one of doubt and insecurity. He points out that his clan is the weakest in the tribe of Manasseh, and he himself is the least in his family. It's as if he's saying, "You've got the wrong guy. I'm not the one you're looking for." But the angel reassures him, saying, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." It's a promise of victory, but Gideon isn't quite convinced yet. He needs a sign to confirm that this message is truly from God. So, Gideon prepares an offering. He cooks a young goat and makes bread without yeast, a symbol of purity and haste. When he presents the food to the angel touches it with the tip of his staff, and fire flares from the rock, consuming the offering. Then the angel disappears. This miraculous sign convinces Gideon that he has indeed encountered a messenger from God, and he builds an altar there, calling it "The Lord is Peace." But even with this confirmation, Gideon's journey of faith is just beginning, and his next challenge will push him to the limit. That night, God gives Gideon a command that's both dangerous and personal. He's told to tear down his father's altar to Baal, a Canaanite god that many Israelites were worshipping, and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. In its place, Gideon is to build an altar to the Lord and sacrifice one of his father's bulls on it, using the wood from the Asherah pole as fuel for the fire. This is no small task. Baal worship was deeply ingrained in the community, and to destroy the altar would be seen as a direct attack on the religion and traditions of his people. It's a bold and risky move, one that could turn Gideon's own family and neighbors against him. But Gideon, though afraid, obeys. He does it at night under the cover of darkness, because he's afraid of what might happen if he's caught. The next morning, when the people of the town see what's been done, they are furious. They demand that Gideon be put to death for desecrating the altar of Baal. But Gideon's father, Josh, comes to his defense. Josh cleverly argues that if Baal is truly a god, he can defend himself. There's no need for the people to take revenge on his behalf. This argument saves Gideon's life, and from that day forward, Gideon is given the nickname Jerubbaal, meaning, let Baal contend with him. Now, with his faith tested and strengthened, Gideon is ready to take on the Midianites. But Gideon, being human, still struggles with doubt. He's already seen miracles, but the task ahead is daunting, and he wants to be absolutely sure that God is with him. So he asks for another sign, this time a very specific and unusual one. Gideon lays out a fleece of wool on the threshing floor and asks God to make the fleece wet with dew while keeping the ground around it dry. The next morning, that's exactly what happens. Gideon wrings out the fleece, and it's so full of water that it fills a bowl, while the ground around it remains dry. But even this isn't enough for Gideon. He asks for one more sign, reversing the request. This time, he asks for the fleece to remain dry while the ground around it is covered with dew. And again, God grants his request. These tests with the fleece might seem strange, but they reveal a lot about Gideon's character. He's cautious, perhaps even a bit fearful, but he's also deeply concerned with making sure he's following God's will. He wants to be certain that he's on the right path before leading his people into battle. God's patience with Gideon in these moments is striking. He doesn't rebuke Gideon for asking for signs, but instead, he reassures him, meeting Gideon where he is in his journey of faith. With these signs, Gideon is finally ready to lead Israel into battle against the Midianites. But even then, God has one more test in store. Gideon assembles an army of 32,000 men, but God tells him that's too many. God wants to make it clear that the victory will be his, not the result of human strength. So, God instructs Gideon to reduce the number of soldiers. First, Gideon sends home anyone who is afraid, and 22,000 men leave, leaving just 10,000. But God says that's still too many. So, Gideon takes the remaining men down to the water and watches how they drink. Those who lap the water with their hands to their mouths are kept, and those who kneel to drink directly from the water are sent home. In the end, only 300 men remain. With this tiny force, Gideon prepares to face the massive Midianite army. Armed with nothing but trumpets, jars, and torches, Gideon and his men surround the Midianite camp at night. At Gideon's signal, they blow their trumpets, smash the jars, and hold up the torches, creating chaos and confusion in the camp. The Midianites, panicked and disoriented, turn on each other and flee. The victory is decisive, and the Israelites are once again delivered from their oppressors. The story of Gideon is one of the most fascinating in the Bible because it's a story of transformation. From a fearful man hiding in a winepress to a mighty warrior leading a tiny band to victory. But it's also a story about the journey of faith, about learning to trust in God's plan even when it seems impossible or absurd. Gideon's tests with the fleece are a key part of that journey. They show us a man who is not afraid to seek reassurance from God, who wants to be absolutely certain that he's doing the right thing. And they show us a God who is patient and understanding, willing to meet us in our doubts and guide us to where we need to be. Let's move on to the next story. So far, we've covered the stories of Adam and Eve, Jephthah and his daughter, Ehud and Eglon, Balaam and his donkey, and Gideon and the fleece. That brings us to the sixth story. This time, let's explore the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. This story, found in 1 Kings 17, is one of compassion, faith, and the miraculous provision of God in a time of great need. It's a narrative that beautifully showcases how God can work through the most unlikely people and circumstances to bring about his purposes. The story begins during a time of intense drought in Israel. This drought wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a direct consequence of the people's idolatry and rebellion against God. The prophet Elijah had declared this drought as a judgment on King Ahab and the nation, which had turned to worshipping Baal, a Canaanite god of fertility and rain. With no rain in the land, food and water became scarce, and people were suffering. Elijah, having delivered God's message, had to go into hiding because of the wrath of Ahab and his queen, Jezebel. Initially, God sent Elijah to a ravine called the Korath Brook, where he was miraculously fed by ravens, who brought him bread and meat every morning and evening. But as the drought continued, even the brook dried up, and Elijah needed to move on. That's when God directed Elijah to go to a town called Zarephath, which was located in the region of Sidon, north of Israel. This was an unusual command for a few reasons. First, Zarephath was in the territory ruled by Jezebel's father, so it was hardly a safe place for Elijah. Second, Sidon was a pagan land, where people worshipped Baal, not the God of Israel. But God had a plan, and he promised Elijah that he would find a widow there who would provide for him. When Elijah arrives at the gates of Zarephath, he sees a widow gathering sticks. She's an ordinary woman, dressed in the simple clothing of the poor, likely worn down by the harsh conditions of the drought. Elijah approaches her and asks for a drink of water, a simple request, but one that would have been difficult to fulfill during a drought. As she turns to get the water, Elijah adds, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." This request brings the woman's plight into sharp focus. She turns to Elijah and says, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." It's a heartbreaking response that reveals just how desperate her situation is. She has nothing left, just enough for one final meal before she and her son succumb to starvation. But Elijah, speaking with the authority of God, tells her not to be afraid. He instructs her to go home, make the bread as she had planned, but first to bake a small loaf for him and then make something for herself and her son. And then Elijah delivers a remarkable promise. "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." It's a bold statement of faith, both for Elijah to make and for the widow to believe. But something in Elijah's words, or perhaps in the presence of God that he carried with him, moves the widow to trust him. She goes home and does exactly as Elijah has said. And just as Elijah promised, the jar of flour and the jug of oil do not run out. Day after day, there is always enough to make bread, enough to sustain Elijah, the widow, and her son. It's a miraculous provision in the midst of scarcity, a sign of God's care and faithfulness even in the most dire of circumstances. This miracle is a powerful reminder of how God can work through the most unlikely people and situations. The widow of Zarephath was a Gentile, an outsider to the people of Israel, living in a land known for its idolatry. Yet she became the instrument of God's provision for his prophet. Her story challenges the notion of who is worthy to be used by God and highlights the theme of God's grace extending beyond the boundaries of Israel. But the story doesn't end there. Sometime later, the widow's son becomes ill and dies. The woman, overwhelmed with grief and confusion, turns to Elijah and says, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Her words reflect a deep sorrow and perhaps a belief that her past sins have caught up with her, that she is being punished. Elijah, moved by her anguish, takes the boy from her arms and carries him to the upper room where he was staying. He lays the boy on his own bed and prays fervently to God, asking, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then, in an act of deep faith, Elijah stretches himself out over the boy's body 3 times and cries out, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord hears Elijah's prayer, and the boy's life returns to him. Elijah picks up the child and carries him back down to his mother, saying, "Look, your son is alive." It's a moment of profound joy and relief for the widow, who now declares, "Now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." This story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath is rich with themes of faith, obedience, and the miraculous power of God. It shows us a God who cares for the vulnerable and the marginalized, who provides in ways that go beyond our understanding, and who can bring life out of death. It's also a story about the power of trust. Both the widow's trust in Elijah's word and Elijah's trust in God's ability to bring the boy back to life. Elijah's time in Zarephath wasn't just about the physical survival of himself and the widow's family. It was also about the spiritual lessons learned in the process. The widow's encounter with Elijah led her to a deeper understanding of God's power and truth, even in a land where Baal was worshipped. Her story reminds us that faith often requires stepping out into the unknown, trusting in God's provision even when the resources in front of us seem completely inadequate. The story begins with David. At this point in his life, David is not yet king of Israel. He's been anointed by the prophet Samuel, but King Saul is still on the throne, and Saul's jealousy has driven David into the wilderness. David has gathered a group of loyal followers, essentially a small army of men who live on the run, moving from place to place to avoid Saul's wrath. During this time, David and his men provide a kind of unofficial protection service for the shepherds and farmers in the region. They fend off bandits and wild animals, making sure that the people's flocks and crops are safe. One of the wealthy men benefiting from David's protection is Nabal. Nabal is described as a very rich man, with thousands of sheep and goats, but he's also described as surly and mean in his dealings. His name, which means fool in Hebrew, is fitting given his behavior in the story. Nabal is married to Abigail, a woman described as intelligent and beautiful, a stark contrast to her husband. The story picks up during the sheep shearing season, a time of celebration and feasting. David, knowing that he and his men have been protecting Nabal's shepherds and flocks, sends 10 of his young men to Nabal with a respectful request. They greet Nabal politely and explain that while they've been in the area, they've made sure that none of Nabal's sheep or shepherds have come to harm. They ask if Nabal might be willing to provide some food and supplies for David and his men as a gesture of goodwill, especially during this festive time. But Nabal, true to his nature, responds with rudeness and arrogance. He dismisses David's men, saying, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water, and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where?" Nabal's response is not just a refusal. It's an insult. He questions David's legitimacy, implying that David is nothing more than a rogue servant on the run. When David's men return and report Nabal's words, David is furious. He tells his men to strap on their swords, and he prepares to march with 400 of his men to confront Nabal. David's anger is palpable, and he's ready to take vengeance, saying, "May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." It's a moment where David, despite his anointing and his reputation as a man after God's own heart, is driven by his anger to the brink of committing a massacre. But this is where Abigail enters the story. One of Nabal's servants, recognizing the gravity of the situation, goes to Abigail and tells her what has happened. He describes how David's men had been good to them, protecting them day and night, and how Nabal's foolish response has endangered them all. The servant, clearly trusting Abigail's wisdom, pleads with her to do something before it's too late. Abigail doesn't waste any time. She quickly gathers a large amount of food, 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs. She loads everything onto donkeys and heads out to meet David, without telling her husband. As she approaches, David and his men are coming down toward her, still seething with anger. But when Abigail sees David, she acts with incredible humility and wisdom. She gets off her donkey, bows down before David, and pleads with him to listen to her. Abigail takes the blame upon herself, saying that if she had seen David's men earlier, she would have given them what they needed. She begs David not to take revenge and not to shed blood in his own cause, reminding him that God has kept him from bloodshed and from avenging himself. Abigail's speech is a masterpiece of diplomacy. She acknowledges David's anger but gently turns his thoughts to a higher perspective. She reminds him that the Lord will certainly make him a lasting dynasty because he fights the Lord's battles, and that he shouldn't let this incident become a blemish on his conscience when he becomes king. In essence, Abigail is telling David to remember who he is and who he's destined to be, someone who doesn't need to resort to violence to prove his strength or righteousness. David is moved by Abigail's words. Her wisdom and humility calm his anger, and he recognizes that God has used her to keep him from making a terrible mistake. David blesses Abigail for her good judgment and for keeping him from bloodshed. He accepts the food she has brought, and he tells her to go home in peace, assuring her that he will not harm Nabal or anyone in his household. When Abigail returns home, Nabal is holding a feast, completely unaware of the danger he narrowly avoided. He's drunk and in high spirits, so Abigail wisely waits until the next morning, when he's sober, to tell him what happened. When Nabal hears how close he came to destruction, he has a heart attack or a stroke, something that causes him to become paralyzed, and 10 days later he dies. When David hears of Nabal's death, he praises God for upholding his cause and for preventing him from taking revenge with his own hands. David then sends word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. Abigail, in her humility, accepts, and she becomes one of David's wives. The story of Abigail and David is a rich narrative filled with lessons about humility, wisdom, and the power of a well-timed intervention. Abigail is one of the standout figures in the Bible, not just because of her beauty, but because of her intelligence, courage, and the way she uses her influence to bring about peace. She's a model of how one person's actions, guided by wisdom and a deep understanding of what is truly important, can prevent disaster and bring about a better outcome. Manasseh was the son of King Hezekiah, one of the most righteous kings in Judah's history. Hezekiah had worked tirelessly to bring the people back to the worship of Yahweh, destroying idols and restoring the temple. But Manasseh, who became king at the tender age of 12, took the throne after Hezekiah's death and quickly reversed his father's reforms. He reigned for 55 years, the longest of any king in Judah, and much of his rule was characterized by extreme wickedness. Manasseh wasn't just a bad king. He was a king who seemed to go out of his way to offend God. He rebuilt the high places that his father had destroyed, places where people worshipped foreign gods. He set up altars to Baal, the Canaanite storm god, and made an Asherah pole, a symbol of the Canaanite goddess of fertility. But it didn't stop there. Manasseh went so far as to put these pagan altars in the very temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, the place where God had said his name would dwell forever. This was more than just idolatry, it was a deliberate desecration of the holiest place in Israel. Manasseh's sins were many and varied. He practiced sorcery and divination, consulted mediums and spiritists, and even sacrificed his own son in the fire as part of a pagan ritual. This was the kind of behavior that God had explicitly condemned, warning that it would bring destruction upon the land. Manasseh led the people of Judah astray, so much so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. The Bible makes it clear that Manasseh's actions weren't just a personal failing. They had a profound impact on the entire nation. Under his leadership, the people were drawn further and further away from God, and the land became filled with violence and injustice. Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that it filled Jerusalem from one end to the other, a stark image of the moral decay that had taken hold. Despite Manasseh's extreme wickedness, God didn't give up on him. The Lord sent prophets to warn Manasseh and the people of Judah, calling them to repent and turn back to him. But Manasseh and his people paid no attention. They ignored the warnings, continuing in their sinful ways, as if they believed they were beyond the reach of divine judgment. But God's patience has limits, and eventually judgment came. The Assyrians, the dominant power of the time, invaded Judah. They captured Manasseh, put a hook in his nose, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. It was a humiliating and painful experience, one that marked the lowest point in Manasseh's life. The once powerful king was now a prisoner, suffering the consequences of his actions. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. In his distress, Manasseh sought the favor of the Lord his God. He humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors and prayed to him. It's a moment of profound repentance, a turning point in Manasseh's life. The Bible doesn't give us the exact words of Manasseh's prayer, but we can imagine the depth of his sorrow and regret as he reflected on the choices he had made and the devastation they had caused. Amazingly, God listened to Manasseh's plea and was moved by his entreaty. God brought Manasseh back to Jerusalem and restored him to his kingdom. It's an act of incredible mercy, one that shows the extent of God's willingness to forgive, even someone as sinful as Manasseh. When Manasseh returned to Jerusalem, he was a changed man. He knew that the Lord was God, and his actions reflected his newfound faith. Back in Jerusalem, Manasseh set about trying to undo the damage he had caused. He removed the foreign gods and the idols from the Lord's temple, as well as all the altars he had built on the Temple Hill and in Jerusalem. He threw them out of the city and restored the altar of the Lord. He also instructed the people of Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. However, despite Manasseh's repentance and reforms, the people still sacrificed at the high places, though now only to the Lord their God. Manasseh's legacy was complicated. While he turned back to God and tried to lead the people in the right direction, the deep scars of his earlier reign couldn't be entirely erased. His son Amon, who succeeded him, followed in Manasseh's earlier footsteps, doing evil in the sight of the Lord and leading the people back into idolatry. Amon's reign was short, and he was assassinated by his own officials after only 2 years. The story of Manasseh is a powerful reminder of both the seriousness of sin and the boundless nature of God's mercy. Manasseh's sins were many and grievous, and they had far-reaching consequences for the people of Judah. Yet, even in the midst of judgment, God's grace was available to him. Manasseh's repentance shows us that it's never too late to turn back to God, no matter how far we've fallen. His story is a testament to the truth that God's mercy is greater than our greatest sins, and his ability to restore is beyond our comprehension. Our next story takes place during a critical moment for the Israelites. After wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, they are finally on the brink of entering the Promised Land, the land of Canaan. Moses, their great leader, has passed away, and Joshua, his appointed successor, is now leading the people. The first major obstacle in their path is the city of Jericho, a heavily fortified city that stands as a gateway to the rest of the land. Joshua, being a wise and strategic leader, decides to gather intelligence before launching an attack on Jericho. He secretly sends 2 spies to go and scout out the city and its defenses. These 2 spies make their way to Jericho, and while they're there, they find shelter in the house of Rahab. Now, Rahab isn't your typical hero. She's a prostitute, someone living on the margins of society, likely looked down upon by the people of Jericho. But Rahab is also a shrewd and courageous woman. She knows that these men are Israelites, and she has heard the stories of what God has done for them, how he parted the Red Sea, how he gave them victory over powerful kings. It's clear to Rahab that the God of Israel is no ordinary God, and she believes that Jericho is doomed to fall before this powerful God. Despite the risk, Rahab chooses to hide the spies in her home. She takes them up to the roof and hides them under stalks of flax that she has laid out to dry. This act of protection is significant because it's not just an act of kindness. It's a deliberate choice to side with the Israelites and, by extension, with the God of Israel. But Rahab's actions don't go unnoticed. The king of Jericho somehow learns that Israelite spies have come to the city and that they were seen at Rahab's house. He immediately sends messengers to Rahab with orders to bring out the men who have come to her. It's a tense moment. Rahab could easily turn the spies over, saving herself and gaining favor with the king. But instead, she chooses a different path. Rahab tells the king's men that, yes, the spies had come to her, but she didn't know where they were from. She goes on to say that at dusk, just as the city gates were about to close, the men left, and she doesn't know which way they went. She urges the king's men to hurry after them, suggesting that they might still catch them. This clever ruse sends the king's men on a wild goose chase outside the city, while the spies remain safely hidden on Rahab's roof. After the king's men leave, Rahab goes up to the roof to speak with the spies. She tells them that she knows the Lord has given the land to the Israelites and that a great fear of them has fallen on all the people of Jericho. She's heard of the mighty acts of God, and she acknowledges that the Lord is God in heaven above and on the earth below. It's a remarkable confession of faith from someone who has been raised in a pagan culture, surrounded by idols and false gods. But Rahab isn't just thinking about herself, she's thinking about her family. She pleads with the spies to swear by the Lord that they will show kindness to her family because she has shown kindness to them. She asks that they spare the lives of her father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all who belong to them when the Israelites come to take the city. The spies agree, but they set a condition. Rahab must tie a scarlet cord in the window of her house, the same window through which she is about to let the spies down so they can escape. This scarlet cord will serve as a sign, marking her house so that the Israelites will know to spare it when they attack the city. The spies also instruct Rahab to gather all her family into her house. Anyone outside the house won't be protected. Rahab agrees and lets the spies down by a rope through the window, as her house is built into the city wall. Before they leave, the spies tell her to tie the scarlet cord in the window and to keep her family inside until the city is taken. Rahab does as they say, and the spies make their way back to Joshua, reporting all that has happened. When the time comes for the Israelites to take Jericho, Joshua gives specific instructions to the army. After they march around the city for 7 days, on the 7th day, the walls of Jericho miraculously collapse, allowing the Israelites to enter the city. But Joshua remembers the promise made to Rahab, and he sends the 2 spies to bring Rahab and her family out to safety. They find her house with the scarlet cord in the window, and they rescue her and all who are with her. Rahab and her family are spared, and they are brought to live among the Israelites. The Bible notes that Rahab and her descendants continued to live among the Israelites, and she became an ancestor of King David, and ultimately of Jesus Christ. In fact, Rahab is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, a testament to her important role in God's plan. The story of Rahab is one of incredible faith and courage. She was a woman with a troubled past, living in a pagan city doomed for destruction. Yet, she recognized the power of the God of Israel and chose to align herself with his people, even at great personal risk. Rahab's faith wasn't just a belief in her mind. It was a faith that led her to act, to protect the spies, and to secure the safety of her family. Naaman was a commander in the army of Aram, a powerful kingdom that often clashed with Israel. He was a man of great influence and valor, highly respected by his king because through him, the Lord had given victory to Aram. However, despite his many successes and his high position, Naaman had a serious problem. He suffered from leprosy. Leprosy was a debilitating skin disease that not only caused physical suffering, but also led to social isolation and stigma. For a man of Naaman's stature, this disease was particularly devastating, undermining his strength and authority. One day, Naaman's household received an unexpected glimmer of hope. Among his servants was a young girl who had been captured from Israel during one of Aram's raids. This girl, despite being a captive, showed remarkable compassion for her master. She told Naaman's wife about a prophet in Samaria, Elisha, who she believed could heal Naaman of his leprosy. It's a touching detail that this young girl, who had every reason to be resentful of her captors, instead offered them a lifeline of hope through her faith in the God of Israel. Naaman, desperate for a cure, decided to act on this information. He went to his king and told him what the girl had said. The king of Aram, eager to see his commander healed, sent Naaman to Israel with a letter of introduction, along with lavish gifts of silver, gold, and fine clothing, as a way to secure the prophet's services. When Naaman arrived in Israel, he first went to the king of Israel, as his own king's letter instructed. But the king of Israel was immediately alarmed. The letter asked him to cure Naaman of his leprosy, and the king knew that he had no power to heal such a disease. He tore his clothes in distress, thinking this was some sort of trap, an excuse for the king of Aram to start a war if he failed to heal Naaman. But Elisha, the prophet of God, heard about the king's distress and sent a message to him. Elisha told the king to send Naaman to him, assuring him that this would be an opportunity for Naaman to know that there was a true prophet in Israel. So Naaman and his entourage made their way to Elisha's house, with all the pomp and expectation of a great military commander. However, when Naaman arrived at Elisha's house, something unexpected happened. Elisha didn't come out to meet him in person. Instead, he sent a messenger with a simple instruction: "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed." For a man of Naaman's status, this was a shocking and, frankly, insulting response. Naaman had expected the prophet to come out, call on the name of the Lord, wave his hand over the spot, and cure him in some dramatic fashion. Naaman's pride was deeply wounded. He was furious. The Jordan River was just a small, muddy stream compared to the grand rivers of Damascus, such as the Abana and Pharpar. Why should he, a great commander, humble himself to bathe in such a humble river? In his anger, Naaman turned and began to leave, ready to abandon the entire endeavor. But then, Naaman's servants approached him with a simple yet profound piece of advice. They said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more, then, when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" Their words struck a chord with Naaman. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that sometimes the path to healing and blessing is through simple, humble obedience. Naaman decided to set aside his pride and follow the prophet's instructions. He went down to the Jordan River, and there he immersed himself 7 times, as Elisha had said. And when he came up out of the water the 7th time, his skin was restored, and he was healed. The Bible says his flesh became like that of a young boy, completely clean and renewed. Overwhelmed with gratitude and awe, Naaman returned to Elisha's house. This time he was a changed man, not just physically but spiritually. He stood before Elisha and declared, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel." Naaman's healing had led him to a profound faith in the God of Israel, and he offered Elisha the gifts he had brought as a token of his gratitude. However, Elisha refused the gifts. He made it clear that the healing was an act of God's grace, not something that could be bought or earned. Naaman, understanding this, asked for something else instead. He requested 2 mule loads of earth from Israel so that when he returned home, he could worship the Lord on Israelite soil, even in a foreign land. Naaman also asked for forgiveness in advance for the times when, in his official duties, he would have to accompany his king into the temple of the god Rimmon and bow there. He wanted Elisha to know that his heart would be devoted to the Lord, even if his actions might not always appear so. Elisha blessed Naaman and sent him on his way, telling him to go in peace. It's a beautiful conclusion to a story of transformation. Naaman, once a proud and powerful man, was brought low by his disease, but through his healing, he was brought into a relationship with the true God. But the story doesn't quite end there. After Naaman had left, Elisha's servant Gehazi saw an opportunity to enrich himself. Gehazi was troubled by the fact that Elisha had let Naaman go without accepting any of the gifts. So Gehazi decided to run after Naaman and, under false pretenses, ask for some of the gifts in Elisha's name. Naaman, still full of gratitude, gladly gave Gehazi silver and clothing. When Gehazi returned, Elisha confronted him. He knew what Gehazi had done, and he rebuked him for his greed and deceit. As a consequence of his actions, Gehazi was struck with Naaman's leprosy, and it clung to him and his descendants forever. It's a sobering reminder that while God's grace is freely given, the consequences of greed and dishonesty can be severe. The story of Naaman and Elisha is rich with lessons. It teaches us about the power of humility and obedience, showing that true faith often requires setting aside our pride and submitting to God's will, even when it seems counterintuitive or beneath us. Naaman's journey from prideful arrogance to humble faith is a powerful example of how God can transform even the hardest of hearts. It's also a story about the inclusivity of God's grace. Naaman was a foreigner, an outsider, and yet God extended his healing and mercy to him. This story foreshadows the broader reach of God's salvation, a theme that becomes even more pronounced in the New Testament. Naaman's confession of faith, "Now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel," is a statement that transcends cultural and national boundaries, pointing to the universal nature of God's love. The story begins as the Israelites are preparing to enter the Promised Land. They've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, and now they're on the cusp of finally settling in the land that God promised to their ancestors. As part of this preparation, the land is to be divided among the tribes of Israel, with each family receiving a portion of land as their inheritance. This inheritance was crucial because it represented not just wealth and property, but also a family's identity and place within the nation of Israel. However, a problem arises with the family of Zelophehad, a man from the tribe of Manasseh. Zelophehad had died in the wilderness, but unlike most other men, he had no sons to inherit his portion of land. Instead, he had 5 daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. In the patriarchal society of ancient Israel, inheritance typically passed through the male line. This meant that, under the existing laws, Zelophehad's daughters would not inherit their father's land, and his family's name and legacy would effectively disappear. But these daughters were not willing to accept this outcome. They saw the injustice in the system and decided to take action. With courage and determination, the 5 sisters approached Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and the entire assembly at the entrance to the tent of meeting. This was a bold move, as it wasn't common for women to present their case directly to the highest authorities. But these sisters were driven by a sense of justice and a desire to preserve their father's legacy. They presented their case clearly and respectfully, saying, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among Korah's followers, who banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin and left no sons. Why should our father's name disappear from his clan because he had no son? Give us property among our father's relatives." Their argument was compelling. They weren't asking for anything unjust, only that their father's name and inheritance be preserved through them since he had no sons. Moses, recognizing the gravity of their request, did something crucial. He brought their case before the Lord. Moses could have made a decision on his own, but he sought divine guidance, understanding that this was a matter of significant importance that could set a precedent for future generations. The Lord's response to Moses was clear and affirmative. "What Zelophehad's daughters are saying is right. You must certainly give them property as an inheritance among their father's relatives and give their father's inheritance to them." God acknowledged the justice of the daughters' claim and instructed Moses to grant them their father's portion of land. But the story doesn't end there. The Lord also used this opportunity to establish a new law regarding inheritance. He told Moses, "Say to the Israelites, if a man dies and leaves no son, give his inheritance to his daughter. If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father had no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan, that he may possess it. This is to have the force of law for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses." This ruling was groundbreaking because it provided a legal framework that recognized the rights of daughters to inherit property when there were no sons, thus ensuring that a family's name and inheritance could continue even without a male heir. It was a significant step forward in a society where women's roles were often limited, and it underscored the importance of justice and equity in the community of Israel. The story of the daughters of Zelophehad is more than just a tale about inheritance. It's a powerful example of how individuals, even those on the margins of society, can affect change by speaking up for what is right. These 5 sisters didn't just accept the status quo. They challenged it with wisdom, respect, and a clear sense of justice. Their actions led to a lasting change in the law, benefiting not just themselves but future generations of women in Israel. This story also highlights the responsiveness of God to the concerns and needs of his people. When Moses brought the case before the Lord, God listened and affirmed the daughters' right to inherit. It's a reminder that God's laws are not rigid or unfeeling but are designed to reflect justice, mercy, and the needs of the community. The fact that God not only granted the daughters' request but also established a new law based on their situation shows his commitment to fairness and the well-being of all his people. The story begins with God's command to the prophet Jonah, the son of Amittai. God tells Jonah to go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before him. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, a powerful and notoriously brutal empire that was an enemy of Israel. For Jonah, being called to preach to Nineveh was not only frightening but also deeply troubling. He likely despised the Assyrians and felt they deserved God's judgment, not his mercy. Instead of obeying God's command, Jonah decides to flee. He heads in the opposite direction, boarding a ship bound for Tarshish, which was likely located in what is now Spain, essentially the farthest point in the known world from Nineveh. Jonah's attempt to escape from God's presence is not just geographical. It's a deliberate act of rebellion. He's trying to run away from his prophetic calling, away from the responsibility that God has placed on him. But as Jonah's ship sails across the Mediterranean Sea, a great storm arises, one so violent that it threatens to break the ship apart. The sailors, terrified, begin to cry out to their gods, each praying for deliverance. They also start throwing the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. Meanwhile, Jonah is below deck, sound asleep. The captain finds him and wakes him up, urging him to call on his God in the hope that they might be saved. The sailors, realizing that this storm is no ordinary event, decide to cast lots to determine who is responsible for this disaster. The lot falls on Jonah, and they question him, asking who he is and what he has done to bring this calamity upon them. Jonah confesses that he is a Hebrew who worships the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. He tells them that he is fleeing from the Lord's command, and that the storm is because of him. The sailors, already terrified by the storm, are now even more afraid. They ask Jonah what they should do to calm the sea. Jonah, recognizing his guilt and the danger he has brought upon these innocent men, tells them to throw him into the sea. He believes that if they do so, the storm will subside. At first, the sailors hesitate. They don't want to be responsible for Jonah's death, so they try to row back to land, but the storm only grows more intense. Finally, realizing they have no other choice, they pray to the Lord, asking for forgiveness, and then they throw Jonah overboard. As soon as they do, the sea becomes calm. The sailors, awed by the power of God, offer a sacrifice to the Lord and make vows to him. As for Jonah, instead of drowning, he is swallowed by a great fish, often depicted as a whale, sent by God to save him. Jonah spends 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, a period of darkness and reflection. Inside the fish, Jonah prays to God, expressing his distress and repentance. He acknowledges that his salvation comes from the Lord alone and vows to obey God's command. After 3 days, the fish vomits Jonah onto dry land, and once again, God commands Jonah to go to Nineveh. This time, Jonah obeys. He travels to Nineveh, a vast city so large that it takes 3 days to walk through it. Jonah begins to preach the message God has given him. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Jonah's message is simple and direct, and to his surprise, the people of Nineveh believe him. They declare a fast, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth, a sign of mourning and repentance. When the news reaches the king of Nineveh, he rises from his throne, takes off his royal robes, covers himself with sackcloth, and sits in the dust. The king issues a decree that everyone, including the animals, must fast and wear sackcloth. He urges the people to call urgently on God and to give up their evil ways and violence, in the hope that God may yet relent and have compassion on them. God sees the genuine repentance of the Ninevites, and in his great mercy, he decides to spare the city. The destruction that Jonah had warned of does not come to pass, because the people of Nineveh turned from their evil ways. But instead of rejoicing at this display of God's grace, Jonah is furious. He feels betrayed by God's mercy toward a people he considers utterly undeserving. Jonah goes outside the city and sits down, hoping to see what will happen to Nineveh. He's so angry that he prays to God, saying, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. Jonah's prayer reveals the real reason he fled to Tarshish. He knew that God might forgive the Ninevites if they repented, and he didn't want that to happen. Jonah's anger is rooted in his sense of justice, but it's a justice that lacks compassion. He cannot reconcile God's mercy with his own desire to see Nineveh punished for its sins. In response, God asks Jonah a simple but profound question. Is it right for you to be angry? Jonah doesn't answer, but instead, he goes outside the city, builds himself a shelter, and waits to see what will happen. As he sits there, God causes a leafy plant to grow up over Jonah's shelter, providing him with shade and relief from the hot sun. Jonah is pleased with the plant, finding comfort in its shade. But the next morning, God sends a worm to attack the plant, causing it to wither. As the sun rises, God sends a scorching east wind, and the sun blazes down on Jonah's head, making him feel faint. Once again, Jonah expresses his desire to die, saying, "It would be better for me to die than to live." God then speaks to Jonah using the plant as an object lesson. He asks Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" Jonah, still stubborn, replies, "It is, and I'm so angry I wish I were dead." God then explains the lesson. Jonah is concerned about the plant, which he did not tend or make grow, a plant that came up overnight and died overnight. Yet, Jonah has no compassion for the 120,000 people of Nineveh, not to mention the animals, who do not know their right hand from their left. The story ends with this question, leaving us to ponder the vastness of God's mercy compared to our often limited human perspective. The story of Jonah is remarkable for many reasons. It's a story about a prophet who runs from God, a city that repents, and a God who shows mercy to all. But it's also a story about the struggle between justice and mercy, and the challenge of accepting God's grace not just for ourselves, but for those we might deem unworthy. The story is set during a turbulent period in Israel's history, a time when the Israelites were repeatedly falling into sin, leading to their oppression by neighboring nations. After each period of oppression, the Israelites would cry out to God for help, and he would raise up a judge, a leader to deliver them. In this story, the Israelites are suffering under the harsh rule of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. His military commander, Sisera, was a formidable adversary, leading an army equipped with 900 iron chariots, which made them nearly invincible on the battlefield. For 20 years, Sisera cruelly oppressed the Israelites, who were powerless against his forces. But then, the Israelites cried out to the Lord for deliverance, and God raised up Deborah, a prophetess, and the only female judge mentioned in the Bible. Deborah was not just a spiritual leader. She was also a wise and courageous woman who held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. There, the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. One day, Deborah received a message from God for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. She sent for Barak and delivered God's command. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go. Take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." Barak was hesitant. He knew the power of Sisera's army, and he was unsure of his ability to lead such a daring assault. So he made a condition. "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." Barak's response might reflect his respect for Deborah's leadership and spiritual insight, or it might show his uncertainty and need for reassurance. Deborah agreed to go with him but warned him that the honor of victory would not be his alone. "Certainly I will go with you, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." This prophecy would play out in a surprising and dramatic way. Barak gathered 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, and together with Deborah, they went up to Mount Tabor. Meanwhile, Sisera, hearing of Barak's movements, assembled his army, including the 900 iron chariots, and marched to the Kishon River to confront the Israelites. As the two armies prepared for battle, Deborah encouraged Barak with a powerful declaration of faith. "Go! This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" With this assurance, Barak and his men charged down Mount Tabor into the valley where Sisera's forces were waiting. The battle that followed was intense, but God intervened on behalf of the Israelites. The Bible describes how the Lord threw Sisera's army into confusion. Although the text doesn't give explicit details, later references in the Song of Deborah, in Judges 5, suggest that God sent a torrential rainstorm that turned the Kishon River into a raging torrent. The river, swollen with floodwaters, likely bogged down Sisera's iron chariots in the mud, rendering them useless and leaving his troops vulnerable. Barak's forces overwhelmed the Canaanite army, and Sisera's soldiers were routed. Every last one of them was killed, and Sisera, seeing that the battle was lost, abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. He ran to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber. Jael went out to meet Sisera and invited him into her tent, offering him a place to rest and hide. She gave him milk to drink and covered him with a blanket. Exhausted from the battle and feeling safe in Jael's tent, Sisera quickly fell asleep. But Jael had other intentions. As he slept, she took a tent peg and a hammer and quietly approached him. Then, with a swift and decisive action, she drove the tent peg through Sisera's temple, killing him instantly. When Barak arrived in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to meet him and said, "Come, I will show you the man you are looking for." Barak entered the tent, and there he found Sisera, dead, with the tent peg through his temple. The prophecy that Deborah had given to Barak was fulfilled. The honor of defeating Sisera went to a woman, not by conventional means of battle, but by a surprising act of courage and decisiveness from Jael. The defeat of Sisera and the destruction of his army marked the beginning of the end for King Jabin of Canaan. The Israelites grew stronger and eventually overthrew Jabin, bringing an end to his reign of terror. The victory brought peace to the land for 40 years. The story of Deborah, Barak, and Jael is rich with themes of faith, courage, and the unexpected ways in which God works through people. Deborah's role as a leader and prophetess challenges traditional gender roles, showing that God's calling and gifts are not limited by societal norms. Her wisdom, courage, and faith were instrumental in securing victory for Israel. Barak's willingness to follow Deborah's lead, despite his initial hesitancy, also speaks to the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when it requires stepping out of one's comfort zone. Although Barak didn't receive the full honor of victory, his obedience and faith in God's promise led to a decisive win for Israel. Jael's actions are perhaps the most surprising and controversial part of the story. She was not an Israelite, and yet she played a crucial role in the deliverance of Israel by killing Sisera. Her actions, while violent, are seen within the narrative as a fulfillment of God's plan. Jael's story adds complexity to the narrative, reminding us that God's ways are often unexpected and that He can use anyone, even those outside the covenant community, to accomplish His purposes. The story begins with Elisha, the prophet and successor to Elijah, who often traveled throughout the region to minister to the people of Israel. One of his regular stops was the town of Shunem, where a well-to-do woman lived with her husband. This woman noticed Elisha's frequent visits and, recognizing him as a holy man of God, decided to offer him hospitality. Whenever Elisha passed through Shunem, this woman would invite him to her home for a meal. Over time, she and her husband decided to go a step further. They built a small room on the roof of their house and furnished it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. This room was to be a place where Elisha could stay whenever he came to Shunem. It was a simple but generous gesture that reflected the woman's deep respect for the man of God. Elisha was touched by the kindness of the Shunammite woman and her husband. One day, as he was resting in the room they had prepared for him, Elisha wanted to show his gratitude. He asked his servant, Gehazi, to call the woman so that he could speak with her. When she came, Elisha expressed his appreciation for all that she had done for him and asked if there was anything he could do for her. He offered to speak on her behalf to the king or the commander of the army, suggesting that he could use his influence to help her in some way. But the woman, content with her life, replied, "I have a home among my own people." She didn't ask for any favors or special treatment. Her contentment and humility are striking, as she seems to have all she needs and isn't seeking anything beyond what she already has. Elisha, however, wasn't satisfied with doing nothing for this woman who had shown him such kindness. He asked Gehazi if there was anything they could do for her. Gehazi pointed out that the woman had no son, and her husband was old, meaning that she had no heir, which was a significant concern in that culture. An heir would ensure the continuation of her family's name and provide security in her old age. Elisha, moved by this insight, called the woman again and told her, "About this time next year, you will hold a son in your arms." The woman was stunned by this prophecy. She had likely longed for a child for many years, but had come to accept that it wasn't going to happen. Her response was filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "No, my lord," she exclaimed. "Please, man of God, don't mislead your servant." It was as if she couldn't bear to have her hopes raised only to be disappointed again. But Elisha's words were true. The following year, just as he had said, the woman gave birth to a son. This child was a miraculous gift, a sign of God's blessing and favor on the Shunammite woman and her family. The boy grew, bringing joy and fulfillment to his parents, particularly to his mother, who had longed for a child. Years passed and the boy grew older. One day, while he was out in the fields with his father during the harvest, the boy suddenly cried out, "My head! My head!" His father, concerned, told a servant to carry the boy back to his mother. The servant brought the child to his mother, who held him on her lap. But tragically, around noon, the boy died. The woman's response to her son's death is remarkable. She didn't scream or wail in despair, as might be expected. Instead, she carried the boy's lifeless body up to the room she had built for Elisha and laid him on the prophet's bed. Then, without telling anyone what had happened, she calmly asked her husband to send her a servant and a donkey so she could go to Elisha quickly. Her husband, puzzled by her sudden request, asked why she was going to see the prophet, since it wasn't the Sabbath or the new moon, traditional times for visiting a man of God. The woman simply replied, "Everything is all right." Her words were an expression of deep faith. Despite her grief, she believed that everything would be made right through the prophet. She saddled the donkey and set out for Mount Carmel, where Elisha was staying. As she approached, Elisha saw her coming and sent Gehazi to meet her and ask if everything was all right with her husband, and her child. The woman again responded, "Everything is all right." But when she reached Elisha, she fell at his feet, overwhelmed with emotion. Gehazi tried to push her away, but Elisha stopped him, recognizing that she was in deep distress. She then poured out her heart to Elisha, saying, "Did I ask you for a son, my lord? Didn't I tell you, don't raise my hopes?" Her words were a mixture of grief and frustration, reminding Elisha of the hope he had given her and the devastating loss she now faced. Elisha immediately understood the gravity of the situation and instructed Gehazi to take his staff and go to the woman's house to lay it on the boy's face. Gehazi set off quickly, but the woman was not content to leave it at that. She insisted that Elisha himself come with her, saying, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." Her determination and faith were unwavering. She wanted the man of God to be there in person to intercede for her son. Elisha agreed to go with her, and they made their way back to Shunem. Gehazi, who had gone ahead, laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sign of life. When Elisha arrived, he went into the room where the boy lay and shut the door, leaving only himself and the boy in the room. Elisha then prayed to the Lord, seeking God's intervention in this moment of crisis. After praying, he stretched himself out on the boy, placing his mouth on the boy's mouth, his eyes on the boy's eyes, and his hands on the boy's hands. As he did so, the boy's body began to warm. Elisha got up and walked back and forth in the room, then stretched himself out on the boy once more. Suddenly, The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha called Gehazi and told him to summon the boy's mother. When she came in, Elisha said, "Take your son." The woman fell at Elisha's feet, overwhelmed with gratitude and awe, and then she took her son in her arms, alive and well. It was a miraculous resurrection, a powerful sign of God's compassion and the efficacy of faith. This story of the Shunammite woman and Elisha is rich with themes of faith, persistence, and the miraculous power of God. The woman's hospitality to Elisha opened the door for blessings that she could never have imagined, first in the birth of her son, and then in his restoration to life. Her actions demonstrate a deep faith, both in her initial trust in Elisha's prophecy and in her determined pursuit of Elisha when her son's life was at stake. The story begins during the Israelites' long journey through the wilderness. After being delivered from slavery in Egypt and receiving the law at Mount Sinai, the Israelites were on their way to the Promised Land. But this journey was not an easy one. The people faced many challenges: scarcity of food and water, hostile environments, and the constant need to trust in God's guidance. Despite witnessing miraculous signs and wonders, the Israelites often fell into grumbling and rebellion against Moses and God. At this point in the journey, the Israelites had to take a longer route around the land of Edom because the Edomites refused to let them pass through their territory. This detour caused the people to grow impatient and discouraged. As they traveled along the Red Sea road, they began to speak against God and Moses, complaining about their situation. The people's complaints were harsh and direct. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." The miserable food they referred to was the manna that God had miraculously provided for them daily. Their complaint was not just about their physical circumstances. It was an expression of ingratitude and lack of faith in God's provision and care. In response to their rebellion, the Lord sent venomous snakes among the people, and many Israelites were bitten and died. These snakes, often referred to as fiery serpents, because of the burning pain caused by their bites, brought a swift and deadly judgment upon the people. The Israelites quickly realized the severity of their sin and the consequences of their ingratitude and disobedience. In their desperation, the people came to Moses and confessed their sin. "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." Their confession marked a turning point. They acknowledged their wrongdoing and sought God's mercy. Moses, as the intercessor for the people, prayed to the Lord on their behalf. In response, God provided a way for the people to be healed, but it was an unusual and symbolic remedy. The Lord instructed Moses to make a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. Then he told Moses that anyone who was bitten could look at the bronze serpent and live. Moses obeyed God's command and made a serpent of bronze, setting it up on a pole in the center of the camp. When anyone who had been bitten by a snake looked at the bronze serpent, they were healed and lived. This act of looking at the bronze serpent was an act of faith. It required the people to trust in God's provision for their healing, even though the remedy might have seemed strange or counterintuitive. The story of the bronze serpent is rich with symbolism and meaning. On the surface, it's a story about sin, judgment, and the mercy of God in providing a means of healing. But the deeper layers of the story point to profound spiritual truths. The bronze serpent itself is an interesting choice for a symbol of healing. In many cultures, snakes were associated with both danger and healing. Danger because of their venom, but healing because the shedding of their skin symbolized renewal and rebirth. In the context of this story, the bronze serpent on the pole represented the very thing that had caused the people's suffering, lifted up as a means of salvation. It was a symbol of judgment turned into a symbol of grace. This story also has significant theological implications. The Israelites' rebellion and subsequent punishment reflect the broader biblical theme of sin leading to death. But God's provision of the bronze serpent shows that He is always ready to offer a way out, a path to life and healing for those who will turn to Him in faith. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to this story in a conversation with Nicodemus in the Gospel of John 3 verses 14 to 15. Jesus says, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, So the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. Here, Jesus uses the story of the bronze serpent to illustrate his own mission. Just as the Israelites were healed by looking at the bronze serpent, so too are people saved by looking to Jesus, who was lifted up on the cross. The bronze serpent becomes a powerful foreshadowing of the crucifixion, where Jesus takes on the sin of the world and becomes the means of salvation for all who believe. The story of the bronze serpent challenges us to think about the nature of sin and redemption. It reminds us that while sin has serious consequences, God's mercy is always available. But it also requires a response from us, a willingness to look to God, to trust in His provision, and to believe in His power to heal and save. Our story begins with the Israelites once again in a difficult situation. They had turned away from God, worshiping the gods of the Canaanites, and as a result, God allowed them to be oppressed by the Midianites. The Midianites were a nomadic people who would swarm into Israel during harvest time, stealing crops and livestock, leaving the Israelites impoverished and desperate. This oppression had gone on for 7 years, and the Israelites were living in fear, hiding in caves and strongholds. In their distress, the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, and God, in His mercy, decided to deliver them. He chose Gideon, the son of Joash, to be the deliverer. But Gideon was not an obvious choice. When we first meet him, he's hiding in a winepress, threshing wheat in secret to keep it from the Midianites. This is hardly the image of a mighty warrior, and Gideon himself is quick to point out his inadequacies. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon and greeted him with the words, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon, taken aback, questioned the angel, asking why, if the Lord was with them, they were suffering under the Midianites. He expressed doubt about God's presence and power, given the circumstances. But the angel reassured him, saying, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon's response was filled with doubt and humility. He pointed out that his clan was the weakest in Manasseh and that he was the least in his family. In other words, Gideon felt entirely unqualified for the task at hand. But the angel of the Lord told him, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." Still uncertain, Gideon asked for a sign to confirm that it was truly God speaking to him. He prepared an offering of meat, unleavened bread, and broth, and when the angel of the Lord touched the offering with the tip of his staff, fire flared from the rock and consumed the offering. This miraculous sign convinced Gideon that he was indeed speaking with God, and he built an altar there, calling it, "The Lord is Peace." Despite this confirmation, Gideon's journey of faith was just beginning. God's first command to Gideon was to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. In its place, Gideon was to build an altar to the Lord and sacrifice one of his father's bulls on it. Gideon obeyed, but he did so at night, afraid of what his family and the townspeople might do if they found out. The next morning, when the people discovered what had happened, they were furious and demanded that Gideon be put to death. But Gideon's father, Joash, defended his son, challenging the people to let Baal defend himself if he truly was a god. From that day on, Gideon was given the name Jerubbaal, meaning "let Baal contend with him." After this, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the men of Israel to join him in battle against the Midianites. But even as the army gathered, Gideon's doubts resurfaced. He asked God for another sign to reassure him that he would indeed save Israel through him. Gideon laid out a fleece on the threshing floor and asked God to make the fleece wet with dew while the ground around it remained dry. God granted this request, and when Gideon woke the next morning, he found the fleece soaked with dew, while the ground was dry. But still uncertain, Gideon asked God for the opposite sign the next night, to make the ground wet while the fleece remained dry. Once again, God granted his request, and Gideon was finally convinced that God was with him. With this confirmation, Gideon prepared to lead the Israelites into battle. He had gathered an army of 32,000 men, but God had other plans. God told Gideon that the army was too large. If they won with such a large force, The Israelites might think they had saved themselves by their own strength, rather than by God's power. So God instructed Gideon to reduce the size of his army. First, Gideon told everyone who was afraid to go home, and 22,000 men left, leaving 10,000. But God said that was still too many. So he told Gideon to take the men down to the water and observe how they drank. Those who lapped the water with their hands to their mouths were kept, while those who knelt down to drink were sent home. In the end, only 300 men remained. With this tiny force, Gideon was to face the vast Midianite army. But God assured him that he would give the Midianites into his hands. That night, God told Gideon to go down to the Midianite camp and listen to what they were saying, to further strengthen his faith. Gideon took his servant Purah and crept down to the edge of the camp. There, he overheard a Midianite soldier telling his comrade about a dream he had. A loaf of barley bread tumbled into the Midianite camp, struck a tent, and overturned it. The other soldier interpreted the dream, saying, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Encouraged by what he heard, Gideon returned to the Israelite camp and prepared his 300 men for battle. He gave each man a trumpet, an empty jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. They divided into 3 groups and surrounded the Midianite camp. At Gideon's signal, the men blew their trumpets, smashed the jars, and held up the torches, shouting, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" The sudden noise and the sight of torches all around the camp threw the Midianites into panic. In their confusion, they turned on each other with their swords, and the entire army fled. The Israelites pursued the fleeing Midianites, and with God's help, they defeated them completely. The victory was not by their own might but by God's power working through Gideon and his small, unlikely army. The story of Gideon and his 300 soldiers is a profound illustration of the principle that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Gideon, who initially saw himself as the least and weakest, was used by God to achieve a great victory. The reduction of his army to just 300 men was a dramatic way of ensuring that the Israelites, and everyone else, would know that the victory belonged to God alone. This story also highlights the importance of faith and obedience. Despite his doubts and fears, Gideon ultimately trusted in God's promises and followed his instructions, even when they seemed illogical from a human perspective. God's patience with Gideon, shown in the repeated signs he provided, is a reminder that God understands our fears and uncertainties and is willing to meet us where we are to strengthen our faith. The story takes place during the reign of King Ahab in Israel, a time when the nation had largely turned away from the worship of the Lord and had embraced the worship of Baal, a Canaanite god of fertility and storms. Ahab, influenced by his wife Jezebel, who was a fervent worshiper of Baal, had led Israel deeper into idolatry. Jezebel had even ordered the killing of many of the Lord's prophets, and those who survived were forced into hiding. In response to this rampant idolatry, God sent the prophet Elijah to confront Ahab and to declare that there would be a severe drought in the land, a direct challenge to Baal, who was believed to control rain and fertility. The drought lasted for 3 years, bringing Israel to its knees and setting the stage for a dramatic confrontation between Elijah and the forces of Baal. At the end of the 3 years, God instructed Elijah to present himself to Ahab and announce that rain was finally coming. Elijah obeyed, and on his way, he encountered Obadiah, a devout believer who served in Ahab's court and had secretly protected 100 of the Lord's prophets from Jezebel's wrath. Elijah told Obadiah to go and inform Ahab that he was there. When Ahab and Elijah met, Ahab greeted Elijah with hostility, calling him the troubler of Israel. But Elijah turned the accusation back on Ahab, saying that it was Ahab and his family who had brought trouble to Israel by abandoning the Lord's commands and following the Baals. Elijah then issued a bold challenge. He told Ahab to summon all of Israel to Mount Carmel and to bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who were supported by Jezebel. There, on Mount Carmel, they would determine once and for all who was the true God. When the people gathered on Mount Carmel, Elijah stood before them and issued a challenge. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The people remained silent, unsure of what to say. Elijah then proposed a test to determine which God was real. He and the prophets of Baal would each prepare a bull as a sacrifice and place it on an altar, but they would not set fire to it. Instead, they would call on their respective gods, and the God who answered by sending fire to consume the sacrifice would be acknowledged as the true God. The people agreed to the test. Elijah allowed the prophets of Baal to go first. They prepared their bull and called on Baal from morning until noon, shouting, "Baal, answer us!" But there was no response, no one answered. As the morning wore on, they danced around the altar they had made, becoming increasingly frantic in their attempts to get Baal's attention. At noon, Elijah began to mock them, saying, "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Encouraged by Elijah's taunts, the prophets of Baal shouted louder and even began to cut themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. They continued their frenzied prophesying until evening, but still, there was no response, no fire, no voice, no sign from Baal. Finally, it was Elijah's turn. He called the people to come closer to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, and rebuilt the altar in the name of the Lord. He then dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold a significant amount of water. After arranging the wood on the altar, he cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood. But Elijah wasn't finished. He then gave a surprising instruction. He told the people to fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and the wood. They did so, and Elijah instructed them to do it 2 more times, until the water ran down around the altar and filled the trench. The entire offering was soaked, making it seemingly impossible for any fire to ignite. At the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah stepped forward and prayed. His prayer was simple and direct, a call for God to reveal himself to the people. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Immediately, the fire of the Lord fell from heaven and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and even the dust, and it licked up the water in the trench. The response was overwhelming. When the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" Elijah then commanded the people to seize the prophets of Baal, and they were taken down to the Kishon Valley and killed, bringing an end to their false prophecies. After the dramatic victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah told Ahab to go and eat and drink, for the sound of a heavy rain was coming. Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel, where he bowed down to the ground with his face between his knees and prayed for rain. He sent his servant to look toward the sea, and the servant reported back 6 times that there was nothing. But on the 7th time, the servant saw a small cloud rising from the sea, no bigger than a man's hand. Elijah told his servant to go and tell Ahab to hitch up his chariot and go down before the rain stopped him. The sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, and a heavy rain began to fall. Ahab rode off to Jezreel, and the power of the Lord came upon Elijah, who tucked his cloak into his belt and ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. The story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal is a powerful demonstration of God's supremacy over all false gods and idols. It's a story of divine power, but it's also a story about the courage and faith of Elijah, who stood alone against overwhelming odds to proclaim the truth of the Lord. Elijah's boldness in confronting Ahab and the prophets of Baal, his faith in God's power to reveal himself, and his unwavering commitment to calling the people back to the worship of the true God are all central themes in this narrative. The fire from heaven that consumed the offering on Mount Carmel was a dramatic and unmistakable sign of God's presence and power. It was a moment of decisive victory for the Lord, a clear declaration that he alone is God, and that all other gods are powerless. The people's response, falling on their faces and declaring, "The Lord, he is God," marks a turning point in the story, as they recognized the truth of Elijah's message and the futility of their idolatry. Elijah's victory over the prophets of Baal, however, was not just about proving a point. It was about turning the hearts of the people back to God. Elijah's prayer emphasized this, asking God to show his power so that the people would know that he was turning their hearts back again. The story reminds us that God's desire is not just to demonstrate his power, but to restore his relationship with his people, to bring them back to himself in faith and obedience. The story begins in a time of spiritual and moral decline in Israel, during the period of the Judges, when everyone did as they saw fit. It was a time when the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. Against this backdrop, we are introduced to Elkanah, a man from the hill country of Ephraim, who had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. This was a source of deep sorrow for Hannah, as having children was considered a great blessing and honor, while barrenness was often seen as a disgrace. Elkanah loved Hannah deeply and tried to comfort her, but Peninnah, who had children, often taunted Hannah, provoking her and making her feel even worse about her situation. Every year, Elkanah would take his family to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord at the tabernacle, where Eli the priest ministered. On these occasions, Elkanah would give portions of the sacrificial meat to Peninnah and her children, but to Hannah he would give a double portion because he loved her, even though the Lord had closed her womb. Despite Elkanah's love and care, Hannah's grief was overwhelming. During one of these annual trips to Shiloh, Hannah went to the tabernacle and, in deep anguish, prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. She made a vow, saying, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." This vow indicated that she was dedicating her hoped-for son as a Nazirite, a person set apart for God's service. As Hannah continued to pray, she was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli, the priest, noticed her and, misunderstanding her silent prayer, thought she was drunk. He rebuked her, saying, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." But Hannah replied, "Not so, my lord. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli, realizing his mistake, answered her with a blessing, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Hannah, reassured by his words, left the tabernacle, and her mood changed. She ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Hannah's prayer was marked by her deep faith and her willingness to surrender her deepest desires to God, trusting that he would hear her and respond. In due time, the Lord remembered Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." The name Samuel sounds like the Hebrew for heard by God. Hannah's joy was immense, and she was deeply grateful to God for answering her prayer. But she also remembered the vow she had made. When Samuel was weaned, likely around the age of 3, Hannah took him to Shiloh, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine to present him to the Lord. After sacrificing the bull, she brought the young boy to Eli and said, "Pardon me, my lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. Hannah's act of dedicating Samuel to the Lord was an extraordinary example of faith and devotion. She had longed for a child for so many years, and when her prayer was finally answered, she kept her promise to God, even though it meant giving up the child she had so desperately wanted. Hannah's story is a powerful testament to the idea that true faith involves not just asking for blessings, but being willing to surrender those blessings back to God in trust and obedience. After dedicating Samuel to the Lord, Hannah prayed a prayer of praise, which is recorded in 1 Samuel 2. This prayer, often called Hannah's Song, is a beautiful expression of thanksgiving and joy. It reflects Hannah's deep understanding of God's character and His ways. In her prayer, Hannah exalts the Lord, acknowledging His holiness, His sovereignty, and His justice. She praises God for lifting up the humble and bringing down the proud, for feeding the hungry and humbling the full, and for giving children to the barren while making the fertile languish. Hannah's prayer foreshadows themes that will be echoed later in the Bible, particularly in Mary's Magnificat in the New Testament. After leaving Samuel at the tabernacle to be raised in the service of the Lord, Hannah returned home with her husband. But God continued to bless her. The Bible tells us that Hannah had 3 more sons and 2 daughters, while Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord under Eli's guidance. Samuel, the child of Hannah's prayer, went on to become one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. He played a pivotal role in the transition from the period of the judges to the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. Samuel anointed both Saul, the first king of Israel, and David, who became Israel's greatest king and from whose line the Messiah would come. Samuel's life and ministry were marked by his faithfulness to God, a legacy that began with his mother's fervent prayers and her commitment to raising him in the ways of the Lord. The story of Hannah and the birth of Samuel is a rich narrative that speaks to the power of prayer, the importance of faith, and the significance of keeping our promises to God. Hannah's journey from sorrow to joy, from barrenness to fruitfulness, is a powerful reminder that God hears our prayers and that He is faithful to answer them in His own time and way. Her willingness to dedicate Samuel to the Lord, even before he was conceived, reflects a deep trust in God's plan and a recognition that all blessings ultimately come from Him and belong to Him. The story begins with a dark and troubling event in David's family. Amnon, David's eldest son and heir to the throne, becomes infatuated with his half-sister Tamar, who is Absalom's full sister. Driven by lust, Amnon devises a plan to get Tamar alone. Pretending to be ill, he asks his father David to send Tamar to his house to prepare food for him. David, unaware of Amnon's intentions, agrees, and Tamar goes to her brother's house to care for him. Once they are alone, Amnon attacks and rapes Tamar. Afterward, his infatuation turns to disgust, and he cruelly sends her away. Tamar, now desolate and dishonored, tears her robe, covers her head with ashes, and retreats to her brother Absalom's house. When Absalom learns of what happened, he takes Tamar into his home and cares for her, but he harbors a deep, burning anger toward Amnon. Despite his fury, Absalom bides his time, waiting for the right moment to exact his revenge. King David hears about the incident and is furious, but he does nothing to punish Amnon, his firstborn son. This lack of action from David only deepens Absalom's resentment, not just toward Amnon, but toward David as well. Absalom waits 2 full years before taking his revenge. He invites all the king's sons to a sheep-shearing festival, a festive event that would normally involve much celebration. During the feast, Absalom orders his servants to kill Amnon when he is drunk and unsuspecting, which they do. After Amnon's murder, Absalom flees to Geshur, where his maternal grandfather, King Talmai, rules. He stays there for 3 years, estranged from his father and the royal court. David mourns for Amnon but also longs for reconciliation with Absalom. However, it is not until Joab, the commander of David's army and his trusted advisor, intervenes that David allows Absalom to return to Jerusalem. Even after his return, Absalom is not immediately reconciled with David. For 2 more years, Absalom lives in Jerusalem without seeing his father's face. Frustrated by this continued estrangement, Absalom finally takes matters into his own hands, setting fire to Joab's field to get his attention. This bold act prompts Joab to arrange a meeting between Absalom and David. When they finally meet, David kisses Absalom, signifying a formal reconciliation. However, the seeds of rebellion have already been sown in Absalom's heart. Absalom begins to plot against his father, slowly building his own power base in Israel. He positions himself at the city gate, where he intercepts those coming to seek justice from the king. With charm and charisma, Absalom listens to their grievances and subtly suggests that if he were judge in the land, he would ensure justice for everyone. Over time, he steals the hearts of the people of Israel, and his popularity grows. After 4 years of this covert campaigning, Absalom makes his move. He asks David for permission to go to Hebron under the pretext of fulfilling a vow he had made to the Lord. David, suspecting nothing, grants his request. But once in Hebron, Absalom declares himself king, and he sends messengers throughout Israel, instructing them to proclaim him as king when they hear the sound of the trumpet. Many of David's former allies, including Ahithophel, a wise and respected counselor, join Absalom's cause. When David learns of Absalom's rebellion, he realizes that his position in Jerusalem is untenable. Rather than risk a devastating battle within the city, David decides to flee. He leaves Jerusalem with his household, including his loyal followers and the Kerethites and Pelethites, his personal guard, and the Gittites, who were foreign mercenaries loyal to David. As David departs, many of the people of Jerusalem follow him, weeping as they go. As David and his followers cross the Kidron Valley and ascend the Mount of Olives, David is deeply grieved. He covers his head and walks barefoot in mourning. Along the way, he encounters Zadok and Abiathar, the priests who have brought the Ark of the Covenant with them. But David instructs them to take the Ark back to Jerusalem, trusting that if the Lord is pleased with him, he will bring him back to the city and the Arkansas. David also sends Hushai the Archite, a trusted advisor, back to Jerusalem to act as a spy and frustrate Ahithophel's counsel to Absalom. Meanwhile, Absalom enters Jerusalem and takes control of the city. He seeks the advice of Ahithophel, who suggests a bold and ruthless strategy. Absalom should immediately pursue David and strike him down while he is weak and on the run. This plan, if followed, might have secured Absalom's victory. But Absalom decides to seek a second opinion from Hushai, who pretends to support Absalom but secretly remains loyal to David. Hushai cunningly advises Absalom to wait and gather all Israel to himself before launching an attack. He plays on Absalom's vanity, suggesting that Absalom personally lead a massive army against David, which would ensure a more glorious victory. This advice appeals to Absalom's ego, and he decides to follow Hushai's plan instead of Ahithophel's. Realizing that his counsel has been rejected and foreseeing the impending disaster, Ahithophel returns to his home and, in despair, takes his own life. Hushai immediately sends word to David, warning him to cross the Jordan River and put as much distance as possible between himself and Absalom's forces. David heeds the warning, and he and his followers make it safely across the Jordan, where they are able to regroup and prepare for the coming battle. As Absalom's forces prepare to confront David, David organizes his troops and appoints commanders over thousands and hundreds. He divides his army into 3 divisions under the command of Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. David expresses his desire to go into battle with them, but his men insist that he remain behind, as his life is too valuable to risk in the battle. Before the battle begins, David gives a direct and poignant command to his commanders: "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." Despite Absalom's rebellion and the threat he poses, David's fatherly love for him remains strong, and he cannot bear the thought of losing his son. The battle takes place in the forest of Ephraim, and it is fierce and brutal. David's forces, though outnumbered, are seasoned warriors, and they gain the upper hand. The terrain of the forest, with its dense trees and difficult paths, proves treacherous for Absalom's troops, and many are killed. The Bible notes that the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. As Absalom realizes that the battle is lost, he attempts to flee on a mule. But as he rides through the forest, his long hair gets caught in the branches of a large oak tree, leaving him dangling helplessly in the air while the mule continues on. One of David's soldiers sees Absalom hanging in the tree and reports it to Joab. Despite David's explicit orders to spare Absalom, Joab sees this as an opportunity to end the rebellion once and for all. He takes 3 javelins and drives them into Absalom's heart while he is still alive in the oak tree. Then, Joab's armor-bearers finish him off. With Absalom dead, Joab blows the trumpet to signal the end of the battle, and the troops stop pursuing the fleeing Israelites. They take Absalom's body, throw it into a deep pit in the forest, and pile a large heap of stones over it. Meanwhile, Absalom's monument that he had built for himself in the King's Valley is left as a hollow reminder of his failed rebellion. Word of the victory and Absalom's death is brought back to David by two messengers, Ahimaaz and a Cushite. When David hears the news, his response is not one of triumph, but of profound grief. As he goes up to the room over the gate and weeps, he cries out, "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" David's lament over Absalom is one of the most poignant expressions of a father's grief in the Bible. Despite Absalom's betrayal and rebellion, David's heart is broken by the loss of his son. His deep love for Absalom, despite all that has happened, is a reminder of the complexity of human relationships, especially within families. The story begins with a widow of one of the sons of the prophets coming to Elisha for help. Her husband, who had been a member of the prophetic community, had died, leaving her in a dire financial situation. In ancient Israel, being a widow was one of the most vulnerable positions in society. Without a husband to provide for her, the widow was often left with no means of support. To make matters worse, she had two sons to care for, and her husband's death had left the family deeply in debt. The widow's situation was critical. Her creditors were coming to take her two sons as slaves to pay off the debt, a common practice in those days when a debtor could not repay what was owed. Slavery was not just a loss of freedom for the sons. It was also the widow's last remaining hope for any support. If her sons were taken, she would be left utterly destitute and alone. In her desperation, the widow cried out to Elisha, saying, "Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my two boys as his slaves." The widow's plea to Elisha highlights her faith and trust in God. Despite her dire circumstances, she believed that the man of God could intercede on her behalf. Elisha responded with compassion and asked her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The widow replied, "Your servant has nothing there at all except a small jar of olive oil." This response underscores the depth of her poverty. All she had left was a small jar of oil, which in itself seemed insufficient to change her situation. Elisha then gave the widow a surprising instruction. He told her to go around to all her neighbors and ask for empty jars. "Don't ask for just a few," he said. Elisha's command required the widow to act in faith, to believe that God was going to do something extraordinary with the little that she had. He told her to go inside her house with her sons and to shut the door behind her. Then she was to pour oil into all the jars, setting each one aside when it was full. The widow did as Elisha instructed. She and her sons gathered as many empty jars as they could find from their neighbors, and then they went into their house and shut the door. The shutting of the door indicates that what was about to happen was a private, sacred moment, a divine act of provision that was to be witnessed only by those directly involved. As the widow began to pour oil from her small jar into the empty jars, a miracle occurred. The oil kept flowing, filling one jar after another. Her sons brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring until all the jars were full. When she asked her sons for another jar, they told her there were no more jars left. Only then did the oil stop flowing. The widow then went back to Elisha and told him what had happened. Elisha instructed her to go and sell the oil, pay off her debts, and live on what was left. The miraculous multiplication of the oil provided more than enough to cover her debts, ensuring that her sons would not be taken as slaves and that they would have enough to live on afterward. This story of the widow's oil is a powerful illustration of God's provision in times of need. It shows that God can take even the smallest and seemingly most insignificant resources and multiply them to meet our needs when we act in faith. The widow's willingness to obey Elisha's instructions, despite the seeming impossibility of the situation, was key to the miracle that followed. The story also emphasizes the importance of community and the role of neighbors in times of crisis. The widow's ability to collect jars from her neighbors was a crucial part of the miracle. It's a reminder that God often works through the resources and people around us, and that our relationships with others can play a significant role in how God provides for us. Elisha's involvement in this story highlights his role as a prophet who brings God's compassion and provision to the people. His instructions to the widow were not just practical advice. They were a means through which God's power was made manifest. The miracle of the oil is one of several miraculous acts performed by Elisha, demonstrating God's ongoing care for his people through his prophets. The story of the widow's oil also invites us to consider how we respond to seemingly impossible situations. The widow could have easily given in to despair, seeing no way out of her predicament. But instead, she reached out in faith, trusting that God could and would provide a solution. Her story encourages us to bring our needs to God, no matter how overwhelming they may seem, and to trust that He is able to meet those needs in ways that we might not expect.